Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, and good morning if you are way out west. My name is Aaron Lacey, and you are listening to Politics, Policy, and the Path Ahead following the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OB3, as the cool kids we hear are saying it, and as we'll be saying it for the remainder of the day. If you haven't previously been joining us, this is the third in a three-part series, webinar series that we've done over the last, I think 5, 6, 7 days. Covering lots of different aspects and angles of OB3. Last Tuesday, we did a presentation that was sort of a soup to nuts comprehensive presentation. We talked about the entire piece of legislation, or at least all the higher education relevant provisions in that legislation. And then Thursday, did a presentation on accountability and really did a deep dive into this do no harm accountability framework. And today we're going to be doing what we're stylizing as our fireside chat. By the way, if you don't know us, Thompson Coburn is a law firm. We have a little over 450 attorneys, offices around the United States, and we have a higher education practice that involves attorneys who spend all or most of their time representing institutions of higher education. And apropos to today's presentation, we also have an excellent lobbying and policy practice that has a significant focus on higher education. And here is my good friend and colleague on your screen, Chris Murray. Chris and I have worked together for, I think, 20 plus years, Chris, something like that. I know we don't look at.
Fortunately for you.
Yes, I mean, we can play 35, but
but we're feeling 50.
Yeah, feeling it. Chris, again, is an attorney, started out as a higher ed regulatory attorney like me, but over the last couple of decades has been a lobbying and policy expert, as you can see on the screen, does lots of stuff with regard to education, not just higher ed, so ed tech and K-12, but spends a great deal of time focused on higher education issues and working with folks up on the Hill to achieve goals for our higher ed clients. While Chris is up on the Hill, I am down in the valley with all the regulatory types over at the department and elsewhere, and spend a lot of my time focused on higher education regulation and sort of the related policy, and particularly on the federal financial aid programs. And we're just delighted, again, that you're here with us today. Couple, 3 disclaimers before we get into it. First of all, as you probably are aware, laws and regulations are changing all the time. Particularly on Tuesday and Thursday of last week, we were very specifically talking about the new statutory framework. We talked about NEGREG and some of those things. But even today, you know, we're going to talk in a more general way, but we're still going to talk about a lot of these politics and policy issues. And of course, things are changing all the time. So if you're watching this on YouTube weeks or months after the original air date, please just keep in mind things could have changed. There are a handful of hyperlinks in this presentation, not as many as in the prior presentations from last week, but still a few, and they are active. So if you pull down the PDF, they can take you to the underlying resources. Also, we have our TC Extra Credit. We have a platform, we call it Regulation now, and it just houses all of our blogs and compliance webinars, videos, everything. A really nice new litigation summary that our litigation team's putting out every 2 weeks that summarizes the status of all this higher education litigation. You can get to all of that through that link. It's all on one place, or you can scan the magical QR code. And with that, I'm pleased to say, let's head to the fireside. So some of you may have noticed today that the bow tie is undone. I've got my pipe here. This is my prop pipe. I've never actually smoked a pipe, but I do have it with me just for today. And AI has presented us with a beautiful study with the United States Capitol in the background. Chris and I were discussing yesterday, we think maybe this would either have to be looking out the back of the Supreme Court or maybe looking out the base of the Washington Monument across the mall and some sort of hidden study. But at any rate, we're going to pull up to the fireside and we're going to go through a series of questions that we're going to trade back and forth and try to just talk to some of the politics and policies that have led up to this legislation and looking forward to what may come. If you are the kind of person who just really loves slides that are packed with information and links and citations, please feel free to go back and watch the ones we did last Tuesday and Thursday, because there's 4 hours of that. Today, we're taking a little bit of a step back and we're having a more relaxed, but I assure you, important and meaningful conversation. So with all of that being said, Chris.
Aaron, by the way, sorry to interrupt. There's a great question in the chat about your undone tie and whether this is the TC version of a distress signal.
no, no, it's not. I'm okay. I'm healthy. I've got
Thank you, Erica, for that question.
Yes, I appreciate the concern from the questioners. No, I'm okay. I'm okay. Just trying to relax a little bit today, again, as we cozy up next to the fireside. All right. So the first question here, Chris, I'm going to direct to you. For decades, as it says on our screen, Congress has reauthorized the Higher Education Act every few years. And that process, however political, it had a rhythm, right? And I know they extended a little bit. It was sort of in the 4 to 6 to 8 year range, but there was a rhythm to it. And then the process changed. We stalled in 2008. Congress stopped reauthorizing the HEA, and the department has subsequently, and not just the U.S. Department of Ed, as you know, lots of agencies throughout the federal government, as we've had a statutory slowdown, have sort of flexed their regulatory powers. As it says, again, we rarely seem to stop and reflect on this really massive shift that occurred. So I wanted to start the conversation today and ask you, we have 2 questions here. I mean, the first is sort of at 40,000 feet, what's happened? Like, what's the meta narrative, particularly around higher ed and HEA reauthorization? Will it ever go back to the way it was? Should it? What do you think?
Great question, Aaron. And I love this format. I love the fire, especially. Thank you, AI. So I'm really, really excited for this conversation. What Aaron and I wanted was to really kind of spend some time like we would as HEA nerds and have a conversation that we would have in front of a fire, or as the last time it happened, in the lobby of a hotel in Vegas for about an hour, just talking about everything in our world and how we got to this place. So for this first question, Aaron, Congress had this rhythm, is the right word. Congress and the Department of Ed had this nice rhythm for a period of about 40 years, 35 years. So between 1965 and 1998, the Higher Education Act was reauthorized like clockwork every 5 years or less. Then, when Congress was done with their reauthorization, the Department of Ed then spent several years promulgating new regulations to conform to the last iteration of the HEA. And as we all know, between the master calendar and neg reg, the process takes quite a bit of time to get through higher ed regulations at the Department of Ed. So by the time they were finished that onerous process, the Congress was once again rewriting another Higher Education Act. So it was this nice cycle where the 2 branches of government essentially spoke to each other. Then there was a long pause between the 1998 and 2008 reauthorizations of the HEA. But I will note, in those early years of Aaron and my career, the conversation was every couple months, is there going to be an extension? When is HEA happening? It always felt like it was around the corner. Then we had the HEOA in 2008, and we've had nothing for 17 years. And then it really felt like the dam broke into a new normal about 2010, when the Obama administration released the first gainful employment rule. So not to beat up on the Obama folks, but they were coming up with a 986-page regulation out of whole cloth, defining 2 words from the original Higher Education Act that had never been defined before. And they were proposing this massive new regulatory structure. It really hadn't been done like that previously. And so the question was then, is Congress going to step in and take their pen back? And the definitive answer was they did not. So Congress essentially handed their pen to the regulators, and in the intervening years, both Republican and Democratic administrations have flexed the regulatory authority of the agency to pass wide-scale, massive new regulations in the absence of Congress passing a higher education reauthorization. Now, the Higher Education Act is not the only law that is kind of in abeyance right now. Many, many other laws are stuck without reauthorization. For example, we have the growth of social media and telecom, yet we haven't had a telecom act since 1996. So a lot of our laws are woefully old. But this new cycle of Congress being inactive and the regulators being highly active is relatively new. And I think it's just kind of happened and grown over time without us sitting back and thinking what exactly happened and why. And we could have an entire political science class at a university discussing the factors behind this, but I think it's really twofold. The first is there's a very unhappy electorate in the United States, and there has been for about 25 or 30 years. The electorate keeps on sending tiny majorities to Congress, and those majorities change every few years. So as a result, no one party really has sustained power for a significant period of time, as we had in the post-war period. And so it's harder and harder to get bipartisan work done. And the other factor, and I'm sure that former Speaker Gingrich would disagree with me, but in 1994, he told his members, do not move to DC, live at home, stay closer to your constituents. And, in a Republican democracy, that doesn't sound so bad. But I think it's pretty bad, because these folks don't live in Washington. Their kids don't go to school together. They're not coaching the softball team together. They're not going to church or synagogue together. And as a result, a lot of these legislators just don't know each other. And now it was always partisan, and folks disagreed on Meet the Press or in the public. But when the doors were closed and the cameras were off, there were relationships that were very durable that lasted for many years. And I think losing that has really changed the tone in Washington. And when you combine that with smaller majorities in Congress, it just makes things very, very hard to get done legislatively.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All super interesting. One of the other things that when it happened puzzled me, but I did not really appreciate what the long-term implication might be. And I know we've talked about this in the past, but others may not be aware of this. There was a belief, a sincere belief in Congress through that whole period leading up to 2008, that the Higher Education Act had to be reauthorized. In other
Correct.
words, if there wasn't a reauthorization or an extension, then the authorization for the programs would run out, and that would obviously be a real problem. And somewhere, I think around that same period, second Obama administration, I remember when this happened. And so I should say the Bush administration, meaning GW, was constantly extending the higher, and there would be extensions periodically, right? And that continued into the first part of the first term of Obama. And then second term, at some point, someone at the department or elsewhere in the general counsel's office sort of reached this conclusion that there was this idea of implicit authorization, and there was really no deadline anymore, right?
Yeah, and by the way, the Republicans and Democrats on the Hill agreed that if you kept on supplying funding to these programs, the authorization de facto existed. I think that's still a very open question whether that's true.
I do too, but exactly. And when that happened, I didn't think that much about it, but in my mind, it really it took the pressure off Congress.
Exactly.
Right? They were scrambling to extend, and there was always, for those in Congress who wanted to orchestrate a reauthorization, there was at least that pressure, right? We got to get this done. And when that interpretation came along, which is shockingly recent, if you think about history, it was just a few years ago, it kind of opened the door for Congress to say, well, okay, if we get around to it, great. If we don't, it's no big deal. This thing, we just appropriators keep giving money and it'll take care of itself. But the problem is, as the folks on the line know, and obviously, Chris, appropriation critically important, but reauthorization is the process where folks would rethink the legal framework.
Correct.
And these key legal
yeah.
ideas. Yes, that's not the appropriations process. And so when the gas came off of reauthorization, or the pressure, whatever metaphor you want to use, I think it just really made it easy for Congress to not get it done. And well, that kind of brings us to the next question here, which is another question for you, Chris. So there was an effort in 2020, right, at a full HEA reauthorization. And I think that's probably the last significant effort that preceded OB3, which we can characterize as, the closest thing to a mini reauthorization or something along those lines that we've had since 2008. So tell us a little about, what was unique about the players in 2020 and why that fell apart, sort of setting the stage for OB3.
Yeah, so we clearly need the stars to align to get any HEA reauthorization to happen these days. So current Deputy Undersecretary at the Department of Ed, James Bergeron, and I were on a panel maybe 3 years ago together. And he said something that just stopped me in my tracks, because I know his relative age and he's not particularly much older than me. And he said he didn't think there was going to be another HEA reauthorization while he was still active in his career. So I'm thinking, 15, 20 years. That knocked my socks off. I don't think he's necessarily wrong, but it really does show that the stars need to align for an HEA reauthorization to happen. So 2020, what happened? I'm actually going to take a step back from 2020 and talk about 2015. So in 2015, the K-12 law, which is called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, so ESEA, so the HEA equivalent for K-12, was successfully reauthorized by Congress. And why did this happen? So No Child Left Behind passed in very, very early 2002. And there were a lot of pretty draconian steps that were going to start happening in 2014 if Congress didn't clean up the accountability systems for K-12. And so there was this really big pressure valve where you had teachers unions and charter schools and parents and lots of different stakeholders that were saying, we cannot live with No Child Left Behind anymore, and you have to fix the K-12 law. And as a result, Congress stepped in. That was John Klein and Bobby Scott in the House, and Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray in the Senate. And no shade to the House folks, but it's usually easier to pass bills out of House committees because they can be done on a partisan basis. And it can be much harder to pass bills out of the Senate because it needs to be inherently bipartisan to clear the filibuster. So in 2015, you had Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray, two master legislators, really at the pinnacle of their authorization powers, as chair and ranking member of the Senate Help Committee. And they came together and spent months and months and months negotiating between and among themselves and their staff about what the new K-12 law would look like. And there were a lot of complicated questions to answer at that point. Then Alexander, as chair, conducted a week-long markup where on issues where there was not agreement, the members could debate amendments and figure out exactly what the path forward would be. At the end of that, they got a very bipartisan product. They went to a conference committee. Klein and Scott got their seat at the table and left their final mark on the legislation. And you had this great benefit of a new K-12 law. Well, in 2020, you didn't have the pressure valve in HEA that happened for ESEA, but you still did have Alexander and Murray together as this dynamic duo of particularly talented legislators. And for Alexander in particular, Alexander, I believe, is our only Secretary of Ed to come from higher ed. After he was Secretary of Ed in the early 90s, he then went on to become a senator. And so he came from higher ed. He had been a college president. And so he really did want to leave his mark and do a higher education reauthorization before he left Congress in a year or two after that. So again, he did a long slog with Patty Murray. There were a lot of conversations behind closed doors. They were working on draft legislation, and all of that was early March 2020. They were planning that first week of March to hopefully do a markup in late March of that year. The COVID pandemic hit, changed everyone's life, and there was really no appetite for any sort of legislation that wasn't COVID-related legislation. It was really too bad of what could have been, because that really feels like one of the last chances that we had for, a chair and ranking member who both really wanted the legislation to get done, and just time was not on their side. I think it's very, very unfortunate that we never saw that bill. David Cleary, the longtime chief of staff director for Mr. Alexander, I have asked many times to see the draft legislation they were working on. Of course, as a good practitioner, he will never reveal that. But that is really what could have been, and the closest we ever got to HEA reauthorization since 2008.
Yeah. I can understand why he won't release it, but boy, that would be interesting. Get a look at it. All right, Chris. So you set the stage nicely. We've talked about sort of the history of HEA reauthorization in the broadest sense, and then we talked about 2020. Between 2020 and today, again, the political landscape has changed considerably, maybe an understatement. So help us understand, in the lead up to OB3, the key decision makers, the chairs and ranking members of the Help and Ed Workforce Committee, have they grown more partisan, antagonistic? How have things changed leading up to OB3? Sort of what was the crucible in which OB3 was created? And also, who are our leaders looking forward? I mean, I've already heard a lot of people talk about, and we may talk later today about some of the challenges with OB3 and whether technical amendments might be on the horizon or other amendments or efforts, outside of obviously something massive like a reconciliation bill to try to address some of these things. So I think very interested to hear your thoughts on who's going to be there, who are leaders as we look towards future legislation.
So I am not going to pretend that on a macro level, American politics is in a good place right now, because it's not. It has been a very, very toxic 10 years in American politics. But one area where I am somewhat optimistic is when you see how these chairs and ranking members, the folks that really steer this legislation, how they get along behind closed doors. Now, their staff don't always get along as well, but how they get along behind closed doors, it does give you a glimmer of hope that, all is not lost. So, for example, Alexander and Murray were very, very different people, but they could come together. They developed a strong working relationship that was successful for many years leading the Help Committee. Same with Virginia Fox and Bobby Scott. Now, their politics is absolutely as opposite as you could imagine, but they're from neighboring states. They're around the same age, and they really had a language to talk to each other and a framework to respect each other. At this point, we have Tim Walberg of Michigan leading the Ed Workforce Committee, and Bobby Scott is still there as the lead Democrat. Tim Walberg is awfully hard not to like. He is a very, very kind and decent Midwesterner. So I would imagine that Mr. Scott and Mr. Walberg will forge a relationship similar to that Fox and Scott had. On the Senate side, it's a little bit different. So Bill Cassidy of Louisiana is chair of the Help Committee, and Bernie Sanders is ranking member. So Cassidy stepped into the role nicely. He has a very, very solid policy operation, very kind of buttoned up, lots of suits and ties. They really take their jobs very seriously. The staff on the Democratic side have always been excellent on the Help Committee. But this is shade, but it's true, and I would debate anybody that disagrees with me. Bernie Sanders has never been particularly interested in legislating. He's more of a campaigner. And in Washington, we call that a show horse, not a workhorse. And so, I don't think that their relationship is necessarily bad, but I just don't think Mr. Sanders has much interest in legislating. Certainly when he had the gavel for 2 years, not a ton came out of the Help Committee. So looking forward, though, there are some pretty exciting people on the horizon for these committees. So the House Republicans have a pretty solid bench of future Ed Workforce chairs, which is good because they have term limits and they have to replace chairman every 6 years. So you've got Burgess Owens, who feels like he's next in line. He's of Utah. Lisa McClain of Michigan, she is Republican conference chair, but could potentially become a chair of the committee. Julia Letlow of Louisiana, she's both an education appropriator and authorizer, and her background is as a higher ed administrator. It's a great office to work with, and she could be a potential chair. And then even Elise Stefanik, if she's stuck in Congress, she has pretty senior standing on the Ed Workforce Committee at this point, so she could be a future chair. Among the Democrats, there are a lot of senior folks on there that I expect to retire in the next few cycles. But Jahana Hayes, who's a former Teacher of the Year, is on the committee and has been since she joined Congress. She's of Connecticut. And Lucy McBath of Georgia are both future Democratic leaders of the committee, and I think would step in well to Mr. Scott's big shoes. So that's Ed Workforce. On the Help side, it's a little bit different. So the Democrats, I really thought that Michael Bennett of Colorado, who played a really, really key role in the 2015 elementary and secondary education authorization fight. I mean, you could see him when they were doing the markup. He was the emissary between the Democrats and Republicans to try to get something done. And so I was really hoping that he would be a Democratic chair at some point, but he subsequently left the committee, and now he's leaving Congress altogether to run to be governor of Colorado. So Chris Murphy of Connecticut is a potential future Help Committee chair. And then there's a really strong roster of brand new freshman Democrats on the Help Committee, including Lisa Blunt Rochester of Delaware, Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland, and Andy Kim of New Jersey, who could potentially take that mantle in the Harkin, Murray, Sanders vein. Now, on the Republican side, it's a little bit harder because you have, besides Cassidy, you have a bunch of Republicans who are very senior, like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who are not going to give up their chairmanship of another committee. And then you have a bunch of other Republicans who don't seem particularly interested in Help Committee issues and would want a chair of another committee. So the one that kind of jumps out to me just as a guess is Jim Banks. He's relatively new to the Senate from Indiana. He was on the Ed Workforce Committee when he was in the House, so he could be a potential future chair ranking member of the Help Committee. And then I guess the final thing I would say, I've complimented Alexander and Murray a lot here, but whether any of these people that I've mentioned that are in the queue really have the legislative acumen to step in the shoes of a Klein or a Scott or a Murray or an Alexander remains to be seen, but I certainly hope that they do, and they have the capabilities of doing it if they want to.
Yeah. Boy, a lot of moving parts, man. It's amazing to me that you keep all that in the noggin.
Well, people is the game of lobbying, right?
Yeah, it really is amazing.
Okay, moving on to the next one. So, okay. So the legislative and regulatory cycle pre-98 created this mechanism, as we discussed, the rhythm, so to speak, of reauthorizations and then the Department of Ed writing new regulations. And there were times when innovation played a key role in pushing an HEA forward. So one thing I'm very proud of my former and now retired colleague, our former and retired colleague Ken Solomon did, is in the 1992 reauthorization, Ken was able to secure via a large coalition of universities to Title IV aid for distance learning for the first time. So if it wasn't for Ken's work in that reauthorization, we might never have had Title IV aid for distance learning. So Congress acting can have a really, really big impact on the innovation culture in higher education. But since 2008, we haven't had an HEA reauthorization. So Aaron, do you think that the static nature of HEA over the last 17 years has hindered innovation? Or, as I think probably some of the folks on CNBC might say, is it's better for Congress not to do anything because they just get in the way, and it's probably better that they didn't act.
Yeah. No, I think I'm sort of in the former camp, meaning I think Congress's inaction has hindered innovation. And the reason I think that is because Congress tends to paint in very broad strokes, right? So it's not that I expect Congress to, in legislation, get into detailed questions or issues around technology or innovation. And I can understand some folks would hear me say this and think, oh my gosh, Congress takes forever to act. They're always going to be behind. Where I think you need Congress is to, even in broad strokes, support the department and the agencies and provide them with, direction and backing. So when they see that something's happening or there's a shift, and right now, I mean, we, as folks on the line know, higher education is experiencing just an incredible time of transition. In addition to sort of all of the things swirling in and around DC, we've got this demographic cliff that we're anticipating in 2027. I mean, we're still sort of working through the grand change of higher education, transformation of higher ed to encompass distance learning. I know that seems like it's been around a long time, but it's just still in its infancy, right? So there are these huge things occurring in the space, and what I think we need is legislators who have enough vision to say the agency needs to do this or the agency needs to do that, even if it's just creating space. For example, and I know, Chris, you're aware of this, the department has this ability for these experimental initiatives, having sort of the Congress create space for things like that, and also through reauthorization, affirm its support for those types of things, and maybe even, then accompanied by appropriations, tells the agencies that innovation is a priority, and it doesn't leave the agency to have to sort of figure out on its own what it is that it thinks should be happening next. And right now, especially with all respect to the department, the agency is extremely resource constrained. And of course, they have a directive from the president to diminish themselves to the maximum extent permitted under the law. It's difficult to see how an agency can embrace and move forward with innovation when it is resource constrained and under directive to further constrain resources. Congress, should it signal its support for certain types of innovation, could change that, right? Because it is diminish yourself to the maximum extent permitted under the law. But if Congress has said, we think you need to do these things, there is still, I think, an expectation that the agency will do those things. Just like I think the agency is going to go through rulemaking and carry out the do no harm accountability framework and all the changes to loan limits and grants, because Congress has told it to do that. So, all of this is just to say, I don't think Congress reacts quickly to innovation, but I think Congress can facilitate and be a catalyst for innovation by creating certain conditions and signaling certain desires. And I think that the absence of any reauthorization has meant that there's just been none of that. And I think on balance, it's probably been detrimental.
No.
What do you think? I'm curious. Do you agree with that?
I could really argue both ways, but in general, I do think it's helpful for the regulatory and legal structure to reflect the current environment of where we are. And I think that's probably most acute when it comes to capital markets and lending, because we have seen what happens when Congress doesn't act in those areas. And so, and then also on oversight, I think one of the areas, now I'm not going to compliment the chairs and ranking members of the Workforce Committee so much, is I don't think they've done a terribly good job of holding the feet to the fire, both Democrats and Republicans, in terms of administrations, of what they're succeeding on, what they're failing on. If Congress was functioning well, I think there probably would have been a series of like 25 hearings on the FAFSA, because that was so public and such a botched rollout. And so
that's a great point.
So I think I do think that there certainly is a role of Congress that I wish they would flex more frequently.
Yeah, great point.
Sure. So my role as a lobbyist is more on the sausage making of legislating. So moving an introduced piece of legislation to from a bill to a law. And then Aaron, your role down in the valley, as you like to say, tends to start when a president signs a bill into law and it moves toward the regulatory processes and it moves to the agency. So, I know in our weekly higher ed meetings here at Thompson Coburn, I'm always talking about appropriations and the latest thing that's happening on the Hill or from the government broadly. But, a lot of times that's just a lobbyist chattering on about what's happening in Washington. And, as regulatory attorneys, you guys really need to dive into the weeds. So at what point of this OB3 process did it land to you, Aaron, that this was going to be a big deal? And in fact, this was going to be a mini HEA reauthorization and potentially make the largest higher ed changes that we're going to see this decade?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, sort of the partner question I always struggle with clients, because we'll have clients who, Chris, you've told me before, what is it, the percentage of introduced legislation that becomes law is like 2%, I think, right now. So there's a lot of positioning that goes on in Congress, obviously, and I think it's always a challenge for institutions and regulatory attorneys alike to have a sense as to when you should really start paying attention and care. I think certainly as soon as we realized that anything was that higher ed was going to be a part of reconciliation, we knew that we had to take that seriously, right? Yeah. Because as opposed to a small standalone piece of position legislation, reconciliation, is probably going to go somewhere. I think back in February, March, when we saw what the House was cooking up and we were looking at skin in the game, at that point we knew it was going to be meaningful. But you and I had this same conversation, and some of my clients and I had this conversation, so you may be out there and recall, you know, higher education policy historically has really been driven out of the Senate. And so, you know, and with all due respect to the folks over in the House, whom you and I both know, the staffers who work very hard on these ideas and are very knowledgeable. But, you know, there was still a sense, notwithstanding the fact that the House had come up with its version of reconciliation, and it included some, you know, very meaningful ideas around higher education and accountability, especially. There was still a sense that we were going to have to see what the Senate had to say.
Yeah.
I think when the Senate showed up with its legislation, we were extremely locked in. I think at that point, you know, you've got a reconciliation process that you know is probably going to get across the finish line. And you know at this point that the conversations being had around higher education are very meaningful. And there's some very significant ideas being floated around. And when the Senate came out with their version, also there was the added knowledge that it is often the case that what comes out of the Senate is what really sticks. And of course, you had the president suggesting he wanted a July 4th, you know, signing. So I think back in March, April, we were watching cautiously. I think by the time we got into, you know, April, May, June, and then when the Senate's version came along, we knew this is the stuff we've got to really lock in on and really be paying close attention to. Now, I will say just one thing. Your trade associations, your lobbyists, your, you know, they've got to, as Chris knows, be engaged earlier because they're trying to impact the legislation. As a regulatory guy, you know, I'm more focused on what actually is going to become law. I mean, I occasionally have clients who will call me and say, hey, what's this about? What's that about? And they are trying to be impactful in the legislative process up on the Hill. But for me, you know, and I will say sometimes to my clients, if you're not trying to impact the legislation, if your goal here is just to be on top of whatever we end up with, you know, don't get too hung up on the early stuff. Some of it's very complicated. I mean, I had schools who called me and say, we've got this skin in the game thing we've been modeling for weeks. And I'd say, well, why are you modeling? I mean, that may not even end up in the final legislation. We don't even know if the Senate's interested in this concept. On the other hand, if somebody calls and says, we want to try to impact this on the Hill, who should we go see? I say, call Chris Murray, and you go talk with people. So I think it depends on what your purposes are. But for me as a regulatory guy, I was trying to really wait to start committing at the point that I felt like I was looking at things that were probably going to become law. But to your question about when we thought this might be something like a mini HEA and really be impactful, I mean, I think even as early as February, March, when the House version came out, we knew this was more than just a little bit on higher ed, that there was going to be some really important stuff in here.
Yeah.
All right. Reconciliation. So now we're sort of at the present. OB3 made significant changes, Chris, to Title IV policy, which we've been talking about for the last week in our series. And some of these changes are clearly going to impact higher ed for years to come. I've got 3 questions. I'll just ask them all at once, and you can take your time working through them as you see fit. So why were so many Title IV changes included in a budget reconciliation bill, right? Was this all part of the culture war on elite institutions? Is that really the focus from Congress, or is there a broader agenda here? And what impact, if any, will this generational shift in Title IV policy? And I think, you know, I mean, it is generational. We've not seen anything since 2008. We may not see anything like this again for another decade. I think that is a fair characterization. What, if any, impact will this have on policy in the midterms?
So the first question, so why did we get so much? I'm going to belabor something here. So, you know, this period that we've been talking about, post-2010, with the original gainful employment released by the Obama administration and the growth in the regulatory power of the U.S. Department of Ed, that is really the reason why we're here. So the Biden administration was working very, very hard to get loan forgiveness across the finish line. And so they failed at the Supreme Court, and they had a 2-tiered strategy in 2024. They wanted to make the student loan repayment system much more generous, and they wanted to regulate student loan forgiveness in a way that might be able to pass Supreme Court muster. They never got to that second part, but they did get to that first part. And so they made the student loan repayment system much more generous. That was in court, but it was a $300 billion net cost that became a bright, shiny object for Republicans on the Hill to say, hey, if we got rid of the SAVE plan and streamline loan forgiveness options, we could potentially get $300 billion or approximately that amount to pay for the extension of the Trump tax cuts, immigration policy, and other priorities of the Trump administration. So the real reason why we have that is we had Title IV in there and not K-12 is there was a desire to use higher ed as a pay-for other Trump administration priorities. So was this part of a culture war? I am not going to dispute that there is a culture war happening against higher ed right now. There absolutely is. I don't think the culture war drove OB3 to being as impactful to Title IV as just the underlying bright shining object of the SAVE plan. But I will tell you that I do think that the culture war did make it more challenging for certain institutions and associations to push back on the Title IV provisions of OB3 because they were dealing with their own legislative, regulatory, and legal problems. And they certainly didn't have the credibility on the Hill with Republicans to push back in the way that they might have 10, 20, 30 years ago. So the culture war is real. I just don't think it necessarily had a ton of impact here. And then finally, will this have any shift? Will all of these changes in Title IV impact the midterms, and where are we going on all that? I, for one, have been very, very skeptical of the impact of changes to the student loan system on elections. I think a lot gets made into that, and there are lots of discussions around that in the news. But I personally think that's overblown. Now, for 2026, I might eat my words, because a whole lot of borrowers are now being pushed into default because their student loan repayments are restarting. There's going to be a lot of confusion in borrowers trying to understand what their new repayment options are. And so you're going to have millions and millions of people facing pretty dire personal consequences if they're not able to get their loans in active repayment. And then the other thing is, and I do fault the Biden administration with this, is I think there's been so much talk in the public sphere about student loan forgiveness that I think it has changed consumer behavior. And I think there are a lot of consumers out there that might not be following every single thing that's happening in the news, and certainly not everything that's happening in our world of Title IV and HEA. And I think for certain borrowers, there is this expectation that, well, one day my loans are going to get forgiven. And that's not happening. And I think it's unfortunate that that narrative was created and still exists for so many millions of borrowers.
Got it. Chris, I'm going to jump. We're at about the 3/4 mark, so I'm going to cherry pick our questions here. So it's likely the case that individual institutions, school groups, and trade associations, and many others, are going to dislike various aspects of OB3. I was certainly vocal on Thursday of last week about some of my concerns in the accountability framework. How do we change the law? Can it be done anytime soon? How long will it be before we see something this impactful from Congress again? What do you think?
This is an area where I think it's critical to get into the fight. And I certainly think there are a lot of communities that are going to be angling for changes to the Title IV portions of OB3. But I don't think any of us should really hold our breath. So first of all, you might hear, or it might happen, that there could be technical corrections to OB3. And that's more along the lines of, should we move a period or a semicolon? And that is something Republicans probably can do on their own. But there is no proverbial gun at the heads of Republicans right now to do any further legislation. There's been some talk of another reconciliation bill, but there is no debt ceiling that is expiring. There is no expiring tax cuts. So I just don't see there being much appetite in Congress to trying to come back to this. For both parties, the other problem that all this is going to create is making any further changes to HEA is going to cost money. So, for example, if they want to put borrowing limits back to where they were, that's going to cost tens of billions of dollars. So they're going to need to figure out what the pay-fors are, and those are going to get harder and harder to find because you don't have something like, the SAVE plan that's $300 billion out there that you could somehow trade away.
Yeah.
So I don't think this is an area where we should hold our breath. But I do think it's an area where, first of all, you've got to get very involved in the regulatory process because a lot can happen at the Department of Ed side. But if anything is acutely impactful to your institution, the next HEA, the next reconciliation starts now, and you should be talking to your legislators about how detrimental the impact is on your institution to try to gin yourself up for success the next go around.
Yeah. Oh, agency discretion.
Okay, I like this question. So it's February 2029. Gavin Newsom is president, and he does the exact inverse of what Trump did. And he said he's going to tell all of his agencies to be progressive and aggressive in getting the Newsom agenda across the finish line. How much does OB3 limit a future Democratic administration from doing what the Obama folks and the Biden folks did? And the one that comes to mind is for do no harm. Is do no harm the new normal and gainful employment going away? I know you covered a bit of that in part one and part two. Or would Democrats want to bring back gainful employment alongside do no harm? And if they did, how would that land? Is that even possible?
Yeah. Let me hit on a couple things and then back my way into gainful employment, financial value transparency, do no harm. The first thing I just want to highlight is there are a handful of places where OB3 in the higher ed context does specifically limit the ability of future administrations. For example, the Biden administration's close school loan discharge and bar defense regulations were expressly limited from ever applying or being applied to any loans that are originated on or before July 1st, 2035. So in that context, Congress has specifically limited the ability to apply the changes that were made by the Biden administration. And of course, to the extent that there are changes around like workforce Pell or things like that, Congress can change those programs again, or could, right? If you had a Democratic Congress along with your Gavin Newsom president. But it would take Congress. The department, it's one thing to try to fill in where there are gaps or where Congress hasn't spoken to something. It's another thing to create a rule that's just inconsistent with statute. You really cannot do that, right? But then there is the question, well, what about in those places where it's unclear? In this case, there's a sense, I'll use financial value transparency, gainful employment. I mentioned last week, there was a desire on the part of some Republicans to try to in the statute specifically say in OB3 to kill those regulations. I think the Senate parliamentarian said you can't do that as part of reconciliation. It's got to be about money.
The Senate never included it.
Yeah, but I thought it was maybe it was the House, but I think there was a desire to do that, and part of the notion was they couldn't
in the House bill, but the Senate bill never had the elimination of gainful.
Okay, maybe it was in the House bill, but at any rate, so the idea is, it was problematic. I think on a go-forward basis, the real question here is Loper Bright, right? Mm-hmm. Because some folks will recall we had the Supreme Court decision, really a couple of them last year, that redefined how courts are supposed to think about the ability of federal executive agencies to interpret and carry out statutes or statutory directives. And, the shorthand is, and this department has agreed to this interpretation, interestingly enough, but the shorthand is if you've got, if Congress had said something in statute and maybe there's a lack of clarity, the agencies are bound to essentially carry out what is the best interpretation of that. So, a court, if it's reviewing what an agency has done or how it's acted with regard to a statutory scheme, that's the question that's going to be asked. There's a lot of background, but all this is to say, I think that this administration is likely, I'm total crystal ball work here, but I think this administration is likely to, notwithstanding their decision to defend the Biden gainful employment financial transparency rule in court, I think they're going to pretty dramatically rewrite financial value, transparency, gainful employment, and do no harm. Implement, do it all at once. That's what the neg reg suggests they're going to do. Is they're going to take all the accountability stuff, put it on the table, and rewrite it. And I think they'll winnow down a lot of these ideas that were present in the prior rule. So the question is, could a subsequent Gavin Newsom administration come along and sort of re-expand it? And I think if they try to do that, then, you know, a court would say, first of all, Congress spoke specifically to what it wants in accountability. And then the department just went through a process and winnowed out all this stuff that Congress didn't speak to. And now you're telling us that the best reading of what Congress did is to add all this stuff back in. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a pretty high, potentially a pretty high bar. I think that's probably going to be problematic. So all this is to say, I don't think what's really hemming in future administrations, be they Democratic or Republican, is OB3 in this case. I think is probably Loper Bright and the redefined sort of construct between how you determine whether an agency and its regulations are properly authorized, and the best reflection of congressional intent. Sorry, that was a very long answer. All right, let's see. Departmental woes. Chris, the department's been struggling. FAFSA, the EAP continues to be a challenge. They've got all kinds of resource constraints. Can the administration really fix the loan programs? Can we get there, especially with all this new stuff?
As Aaron, you know, I've done a ton of work on the loan program for at least about 15 years. And this is an area where I'm deeply pessimistic. So I have friends that work at FSA. I want FSA to succeed, but FSA has made a mess of the loan program and of really every big system change that they've had to look after over the last decade plus. And I don't sense that it's going to get any better anytime soon. So the direct loan program, I think overall, is a pretty resounding failure. So it started in the 92 reauthorization under Ted Kennedy. It worked essentially as a public option between 92 and 2010 for 18 years, where about 20% of loan volume went through the direct loan program and the other 80% went through the FFEL program. And the department, FSA in particular, has just not been able to manage this $1.7 trillion bank with fidelity. And when you layer it upon that, the other systems that they need to build and maintain and update, they just haven't been up to the task. Now, what I would like to see is real legislative reform in this area. Consider items like a complete overhaul of FSA as a performance-based organization and what exactly they are there to do and what their mandate is. Perhaps having a private advisory board to keep them accountable for their work. But FSA is deeply broken. It is something that Democratic and Republican administrations struggle with. And I certainly don't think moving the loan program to another agency is going to fix that. What I think we really need is fundamental reform of FSA.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think?
It's sad.
Yeah. And what do you think is I mean, it doesn't seem like we're well positioned for that probably anytime soon.
Honestly, if I ever got a copy of that 2020 Alexander Murray HEA reauthorization going to the FSA section and seeing if there were changes to the PBO orientation of FSA would probably be one of the first 5 things I would look for in that piece of legislation. I don't sense a lot of interest on this, but I will also tell you that among the authorizers, there are now pages and pages of appropriations riders of Congress essentially yelling at the department every year for the mistakes that they're making about the loan program. So Congress is paying attention in some ways, but appropriations are annual, and what you need is a long-term fix via authorization.
Yeah. All right, Chris, we're going to go out looking into the future.
Okay.
So let's look ahead to the next 10 years or so. We got about 4 or 5 minutes left here. And stick around, by the way, for CLE. Then I'm going to get to the next secret word. So don't clock out yet. What are the top things that you think Democrats in Congress will want to change about OB3? And what do you think are the top items that Republicans will want to keep from OB3 no matter what?
So to be totally clear, I think the Democrats want to change almost everything. Even workforce Pell, they were supportive of workforce Pell, but this is certainly a Republican version of workforce Pell, not a Democratic or bipartisan version of workforce Pell. I know some of my Republican friends in Congress might disagree with that, but this was a Republican version of workforce Pell. So I think they will want to change almost everything. But beyond that, I think the changes to eligibility for student loans, repayment, and the Pell Grant program are probably going to be on the top of their list, and they're going to be on the top of their list for years to come. For Republicans, I think it's a pretty interesting landscape for them. So Republicans have been lamenting the shift to 100% direct loans since 2010. And they have made very clear behind closed doors that it's nearly impossible for them to just go back to the old guaranteed student loan program of FFEL in one fell swoop. And I think OB3 is essentially, for Republicans, a down payment for future student loan reforms in trying to get step by step, piece of legislation by piece of legislation back towards a federally guaranteed loan program rather than a federally operated loan program. Now, whether Democrats allow them to do that, because Democrats certainly should be in control of Congress, every once in a while over the next 15 years or so, remains to be seen. But I do think that this was one step of many that Republicans are hoping to have. The other thing I would mention is, just like the changes in the process of how legislation happens in Washington and how it's slowed down dramatically, I also think we need to all kind of take a step back and reflect that the 2008 to 2025 period was the peak in terms of the generosity, especially of the loan programs for students and families. And so we have now receded off of that a little bit, not all the way back to where we were 20 years ago, but the programs are not as generous as they once were. And so Republicans still view that as just off the peak. And I think they're going to try to push that down further. Meanwhile, Democrats would like to kind of undo OB3 and get back to where we were so that folks can take out the loans that they need to support their education. But there are also a lot of other fundamental questions that can be uncomfortable for higher ed, can be uncomfortable for the trade association community about, is there a problem with the cost of education? Are certain programs too expensive? That's why we have all these conversations about ROI and do no harm and debt to earnings ratios, because out there in the community, there are a lot of concerns, especially in the public, about the ROI on college. And so I certainly don't think that conversation is going away. And I think we're going to be talking about loan limits for a long time to come.
Yeah, agree. Quick note, here is our platform where you can get to all our compliance resources, webinars. This video will be up in a couple of days. And let's see, I think we do have at least one or two more questions we can try to get. Chris, you got a couple more minutes here?
Sure, I do.
A couple of questions. So any thoughts to moving the loan programs back to private lenders? Chris, you just talked about that you think the Republicans are, that's part of the long-term goal here. Any additional thoughts on this idea of moving a return to FFEL?
Yeah, so there are obviously two components of this. So when Aaron and I went to law school, you could take out a certain amount of federally guaranteed student loans. I think in my second year of law school, that was like $28,500. And then the maximum you could borrow was $52,000. And so that gap you had to fill with private student loans if you needed that much. And I do think that Republicans want to get back to a private sector-based federally guaranteed program for the federal component of the loan program. But because of OB3, there are a lot of graduate and professional programs that the full cost of attendance is not going to be covered. So as a result, institutions right now, and many of you are woefully aware of this because you're working on this right now, are trying to work with private student lenders to create that, to fill that gap. So similar to when Aaron and I went to law school, they're not going to be folks going to, say, medical school that the federal government's only going to cover in terms of loans about half the cost of your attendance, and you're going to have to get anywhere from 20 to 50% of your overall loan volume from private lenders. So I think the real question there is like, what exactly do you mean by private lenders at FFEL or the new program? The other thing, and Aaron, I'd love for you to talk about this for a second, is I also think that there are regulatory considerations for institutions who are trying to now stand up private student lending to fill that gap, because if you have certain regulatory constraints, that might impede your ability to get your students packaged into private loans.
Yeah, I'll just remind folks because with when FFEL sort of sunset, a lot of the concerns around preferred lender lists and all those things. If you've been around long enough, you'll remember, '07, '08, '09, all the allegations around preferred lender list, and that was actually a big part of 2008. The reauthorization it included a whole new section on preferred lender lists. So there's that, first of all, and those apply if you have a list of preferred private lenders. Keep in mind, you can walk right into all those preferred lender requirements. We used to do so much work around all of that. But the other thing is, and the other thing is states increasingly, and some of you may be familiar with all the new laws out or the new law in California, are increasingly requiring institutions that make their own loans. And that could be the thing about California is their new law really has such a broad definition of what it means to extend credit. It's an even sort of lower bar than Reg Z and the federal idea, that a lot of institutions of higher education are now deemed lenders. But it was already the case that over the last few years, there's been an uptick in the number of states that have laws that would require institutions of higher education to potentially have to register as lenders. And so now, we're not just talking about extensions of credit in the form of a payment plan or something along those lines. We're talking about the possibility of institutions actually making institutional loans, right? And then having maybe a third-party servicer or someone help you. I don't mean financial aid third-party servicer. I mean like a loan servicer help you service that portfolio. But it's absolutely true that if you move into that space, there are complexities, right? I mean, you've got federal law, like I said, there's Reg Z. In the U.S. Department of Education regulations, there are regulations around private education loans, which some of you are probably familiar with, and disclosures you have to make to students. And then there are an increasing number of states that are requiring institutions that are extending credit to register as lenders. And in some cases, those bars are very low. So yes, if you are thinking about moving into any kind of institutional loan concept, I mean, there are two concepts here. One is you find an external lender that is willing to lend to your students, and you're not really even involved as the lender yourself or lender of record. And those exist. And I think because professional and graduate students who are really the ones experiencing the shortfall here also tend to pay back their loans and take on large volume of debt. And sometimes actually have, a higher, their credit scores are better. I think there will be private lenders that move into that space, just like there used to be, and are willing to make law loans and medical school loans and things like that. But I'll just say more generally, I mean, if you're moving in that direction, particularly if you're going to act as a lender, please be very thoughtful and understand there's a lot of regulatory stuff to get through. By the way, on this website right here that's on your screen right now, if you go to compliance resources, we have an institutional loan primer, and it's a multi-page document. Yeah, that's designed specifically. It's free, and it's designed for institutions that are interested in making institutional loans. It's probably 3 or 4 years old, but it is mostly still up to date. So I think it is well worth reading. And we'll probably try to get an updated version out on the wire soon. But
Aaron, can I make a quick point on that? And I don't want to scare people too much, but
yeah,
ITT Tech in the 2010-2015 period, after the GFC, did have a creative institutional loan program that they operated temporarily. And then via death by 1,000 cuts during the Obama administration, they were essentially put out of business. So I don't want to put the fear of God in all of you, but I want to put the fear of God of all of you is whatever you choose to do with private lenders, you should be doing in close conjunction with counsel and really, really thoroughly vet it. Because while I don't think you probably would have a problem with this administration, if you got a Gavin Newsom administration and you had an agency looking to be really, really stringent with requirements, I would not want any other institution to get stuck in the pitfalls that wound up taking down ITT.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the CF, and I know a lot of folks on the line are thinking, well, ITT, we're a totally different kind of school. Fair enough. But this is what the CFPB does, right? And if it's gone, there may be a new version of it, right, in a Gavin Newsom administration. That's very much what their focus is on those lending activities. I'll just remind folks too, again, if you weren't around in 07, 08, 09, as someone who was, it started with Elliot Spitzer and then became Andrew Cuomo's big thing, but they were going after financial aid directors nationwide. And there was a great deal of criticism of the relationships that institutions had with private lenders. And the allegation was that financial aid directors and others were getting perks that went beyond, the nominal, trips to places, things like that. And there were several very high-profile institutions that reached multi-million-dollar settlements with Andrew Cuomo. That was a big part of what sort of catapulted his political career, was that particular campaign. So if you weren't around back then, or you just weren't in higher education, ask somebody who was. But again, as we move back into private loan and private lending, I don't mean to suggest it's all bad. I'm one of those people. I think there were probably benefits. I think some of those servicers and lenders probably did pretty good work. But there are plenty opportunities to get sideways with some of the regulatory frameworks. So just please be thoughtful about that. We've been shaking the big scary stick here for about 5 minutes, Chris. One final note, and then we got to drop because I think we're about to get cut off. Someone did note that the department, on that reporting on the financial value transparency and gainful employment reporting, somebody said the department did not send confirmations for the people who may previously have reported and can't confirm prior receipt. I did not know that. If that is true, and they've asked the question, resubmit ? I would. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. There were all these delays. You had a change of administration. If you've already got that data locked and loaded, and keep in mind, it should not really have changed because it was for prior award years, I think it is wise to consider resubmitting. I mean, if it's like practically difficult or just nearly impossible for you for some reason, maybe reconsider, talk with counsel. But I think the easy answer would be, yeah, I would seriously consider resubmitting. All right. Thanks to everybody for attending. If you made it through all three in the series, particular special thanks to you. Please fill out the post-webinar survey. We're always grateful for that feedback. Hope you enjoyed this sort of change of pace. Otherwise, I'll just say on behalf of myself and Chris, until next time, be well.